Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'll just introduce myself. I'm Mike Gottfredson. I'm the treasurer at Utah Chapter of APA. I'm also Assistant Director of Community Development at Duchesne County. And like many of you, we were pleasantly surprised, I guess, when we got notification that the state has passed some, legislature had passed some code that has required us to review our concentrated animal feeding operation zoning ordinances if we have them, and that sent us on a little bit of a fun journey for our county. And I had some questions as to whether other counties were going through the same adventure, and so that led to our conversations here today. I'm going to go through a little bit of a presentation just to review the requirements that have been set out by the state legislature in defining what large concentrated animal feeding operations are for the state, and what, if we were to adopt a zoning ordinance in regards to those, what that would entail, and the different kind of mapping and geographic location requirements for that. So as I go through that, feel free to ask any questions that you have. We will be going through some questions and discussion at the end. I am going to ask Adam Richens out of Miller County to go through some of his background with CAFOs that led to this legislation. And he'll be talking about that after I go through this brief overview. And after that, we'll again have some questions. We're going to try to keep this informal, except for, of course, my presentation. So I'll share that with you now. So concentrated animal feeding operations and Utah's new requirements. I'll be going through first, what is CAFO, and really what that means is as it pertains to our definition, or as defined by the state. Because as we went through, we saw that the definitions differed slightly for different locations, different states. Through USDA, they have their own definition, and that our definition here in the state doesn't necessarily supersede that of the federal government or others, but it does add to it. Other definitions that will be important as we move forward with what a land use ordinance and the requirements for CAFOs or large CAFOs would be. And the different criteria and requirements that we shall consider when looking to designate a geographic area for a large concentrated animal feeding operation. Definitions. So we're going to go through several of them. The most important thing that we should remember when going through these different definitions is that this is a source of where we should go for these definitions of what an animal feeding operation or a large animal feeding operation, concentrated animal feeding operation would be, and what a commercial enterprise and health facility, these other things are defined in the state code. So animal feeding operation is where animals have been or will be stabled or confined or fed or maintained for a total of 45 days or more in the 12-month period. Crops, vegetation, etc. Normal growing season over any portion of lot or facility. Commercial enterprise, it's interesting that they define this, is a building used as part of a business that manufactures goods, delivers services, or sells goods or services customarily and regularly used by the general public during the entire calendar year and connected to electric or water systems. Now, they specifically say in their definition of a commercial enterprise that this does not include an agricultural operation. County large concentrated animal feeding operation land use ordinance, that's a mouthful. That will be defined here, and we'll get into that in more detail here in this next section. A healthcare facility is defined by the state. Didn't include that here, but if you'd like to get into the nitty-gritty details, you can go to that section. An education institution is defined here as a building in which any part is used for more than 3 hours each weekday during the school year as public or private, elementary, secondary, kindergarten. State institution as defined by the state. A private institution of higher education in the state accredited by a regional or national accrediting agency, USDA. Now, large concentrated animal feeding operation. This is where it gets into a specific definition that supersedes any definition that we have individually as counties. We can add to that definition, I believe, in some way or manner. However, it must comply to these items listed in this definition. An animal feeding operation that stables or confines as many as or more than the numbers of animals specified in any of the following categories: 700 mature dairy cows, whether milked or dry, 1,000 veal calves, 1,000 cattle other than mature dairy cows or veal calves, with cattle including heifer, steers, bulls, and cow-calf pairs. 2,500 swine, each weighing 55 pounds or more, 10,000 swine, each weighing less than 55 pounds or more, or 55 pounds, excuse me. 500 horses, 1,000 sheep, 10,000 sheep or lambs, 55,000 turkeys, 30,000 laying hens, broilers, if the animal feeding operation uses a liquid manure handling system. 125,000 chickens other than laying hens if the animal feeding operation uses other than a liquid manure handling system, or 5,000 ducks if the animal feeding operation uses liquid manure handling system. A manure, this is an interesting definition by the state. It's about that time in the day when we reflect on the definition of manure, I guess. It includes manure, bedding, compost, a raw material or other material commingled with manure or set aside for disposal. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't quite define manure as I know it. However, it does include material, commingled with manure. Public area is land that is owned by federal government, the state, or other political subdivision, etc., that attract the public to concentrate and remain in the area. It's part of a public park, preserve a recreational area by the federal government, state, or political subdivision, has cultural, archaeological, scientific, or historic significance, or contains a rare or valuable ecological system. Getting broad there, including a state recognized, a site, recognized as a National Historic Landmark or site, or is a cemetery. A religious institution is a building or grounds used at least monthly for religious services. So as you go back through the code, you can go through these different definitions as you identify in your areas what are religious institutions, what are public areas, what are those educational institutions, etc. And then from there, you'll be able to identify those areas for and help establish where a proper geographic area for large concentrated animal feeding operations should be.
Hey, Mike.
Yes.
Can you jump back? Was that last slide that referred to cemeteries? That was part of public lands, was that right? Public area?
Public area.
So how does that apply to, do you know how that applies to private cemeteries?
Well, in here, it does, I don't know if that would be a non-governmental area. And I'm not sure if, it doesn't specify any more than that, Scott. So it may be up to the county to interpret what that cemetery would be. And if it is private, if that area has, cultural significance for the area or history associated with it, that might definitely apply.
Okay, sounds good.
Land use ordinance requirements. So the state has required each county who to take a look at their ordinances and to adopt a land use ordinance for large animal or concentrated animal feeding operations. And they set a deadline. That deadline, if you'd like to restrict, you don't have to have that ordinance necessarily, but if you'd like to restrict where these sites go, then you have a deadline for February 1st of this next year. Now, in between that time and now, you can entertain where these large CAFOs would be without having to comply to the proposed ordinance that you are entertaining. So they give us that leeway at least. Now, there's some very straightforward language here that says that this ordinance that each county would need to adopt if you want to restrict where CAFOs, large CAFOs would be, they shall do the following things. They shall designate geographic areas of sufficient size to support large CAFOs, and that includes state trust lands in compliance with subsection 53C1-1038, as we all know. That would take some coordination for ourselves in our county. We typically work in coordination with our SITLA partners, but they tend to, run their own land here. But that includes adopting a map, as will be described. So that ordinance requires that there's a geographic area and establish requirements and procedures for applying for a land use decision that provides reasonable opportunity to operate these large CAFOs.
Can I, am I allowed to interrupt, or would you prefer I ask
Scott.
questions at the end? So maybe, apparently I'm going to be that guy today.
I was expecting as much.
So if we don't adopt something by February 1st, does that mean we're no longer allowed to adopt something?
I didn't see anything else in the clause that
I mean, doesn't that essentially strip us of land use power in our own county? Like, shouldn't
like many things that come from the,
Yeah.
come from the legislature, right?
I just find it interesting because in theory, historically, we would have been able to adopt something regulating CAFOs via legislative process. So yeah, I guess if we weren't to adopt something prior to February 1st, yeah, I guess I don't know what I'm trying to say. If we're no longer able to adopt something, then that would seem like the purpose of this bill. But if we could still continue to adopt something following that, then I see no purpose to this bill. Maybe, I guess it provides some definitions and guidance, but.
Well, that's a good question. And one, I may not be qualified to answer other than to, restate and bring up that question of, okay, what is the intent of the bill and what are the implications of not adopting by that February 1st deadline? And I don't have an answer for that for you here, but I'm sure we can get to a good point or a good answer for you, or at least an answer for you at a later point.
Mike, if I could add, I don't know who is asking the question.
Scott Lyons, excuse me.
Oh, Scott, good afternoon. Bruce Parker just chiming in. Clearly, if the county is going to adopt something, they've got to comply with these provisions in Senate Bill 130 when they're going to be eventually codified into the county code. If you want to risk adopting something that's divergent from these provisions, you'll do so at the risk of not complying with state law. And so that would be an easy challenge, I would believe, that if you have a CAFO ordinance that does not follow strictly the provisions that are established by state law, you will, I believe, be quickly found to be inconsistent with the state law provisions. Now, having said that, you may be able to go a little bit further. Indeed, if you can find a reason to do so for your particular county. But then those additional provisions also must be found to be consistent or comply in spirit and intent with what the state law would be, it is going to be once it's codified. Proceed to comply with Senate Bill 130 and its codification, or proceed to do something different at your own risk.
Thank you.
And I agree with that, Bruce. I think that's very valuable input. I guess maybe my question was specific to the February 1 deadline.
Mhm.
Oh,
But yeah.
yeah, no, I think you're under a hard time frame too, Scott, and everyone. It's just like our moderate income housing provisions. There's dates there that we've got to comply with, and that's the reality of the state mandate to local government.
Thanks. So in addition, the land use, some other requirements is that this ordinance that we provide for our county shall disclose fees that are imposed to apply for the land use decision, and disclose any other requirement outside of those fees that are imposed by the county, and then provide for administrative remedies consistent with the chapter as people who apply, parties who apply, go through that process. Now, this ordinance does not authorize the county to regulate the operation of large concentrated animal feed operations in a way that conflicts with state or federal statutes or regulations. And nothing in this part supersedes or authorizes enactment of an ordinance that infringes on Chapter 41 or Title 4, Chapter 44. That is, Chapter 41 in the code is agricultural, industrial, or critical infrastructure material protection areas, or Title 4, Chapter 44, Agricultural Operation Nuisances Act. And you can look those up and get into those details as you move forward with constructing this land use ordinance. And I will include a link to those embedded here in this presentation for you at the end for you to review, but we're not going to go into detail there. Suffice to say, or in short, make sure that this land use ordinance does not conflict with those laws or statutes. So this is the part that I jumped to almost immediately when I saw that there were new requirements, and that is the mapping part. There's a geographic area to be designated as part of this land use ordinance, and within those geographic areas, large CAFOs are allowed to operate. And the criteria considered for adopting this geographic area of the county for large CAFOs, the county shall consider, again, the word shall consider the following. One is the distance of the geographic area measured in feet from the following: residential zone, healthcare facility or zones, healthcare facilities, public areas, education institutions, religious institutions, commercial enterprise, municipal boundary, and a state or county highway or road. So those should be considered when looking, okay, if there's a proposed, this area is in consideration for those large CAFOs, how far away are they from these areas? The other items criteria that should be considered: prevailing winds, topography, economic benefits to the county, and reasonable access to transportation, water, and power infrastructure. Those are the items that shall be considered. Items that may be considered are criteria in addition to those described. So the state does not restrict counties from including other items for those to be considered, criteria to be considered when looking at designating geographic area for these large CAFOs. And then based on criteria described, the county shall designate that area as required and prepare a map available to public. So not only do you consider those things when creating the map, but they will make a map and make it available to the public. Now, this is something that some of us may be guilty of, but geographic areas are not to be based on uniform setbacks alone. When looking at the code, the county code that is ours at Duchesne County, we found that there were two main requirements for any area or any CAFO, large animal or concentrated animal feed operation within the county. Those two requirements that we should consider is that they must be at least 10,000 feet back from pretty much anything, from boundaries of municipalities, 10,000 feet back from religious institutions, from wells, water, water features, any of those major things. It has a uniform setback of 10,000 feet. And in addition to that, it must be 1,000 feet setback within its parcel itself. Well, we have a pretty large county, but when we actually went forward and mapped what that looked like with just a uniform setback of 10,000 feet plus the additional 1,000 feet from the property line, we found that we only had some 24, 25 acres or parcel in just a few parcels left available within our private land within the county that would qualify, and it just clearly was not enough for the
I'm trying to
the
switch it, but
available for those
not
who
giving me any
like to
audio.
operate or even look into operating a CAFO or a large CAFO within the county. So this I can see where this makes sense, but needless to say, and we're amending our zoning ordinance, you cannot consider a uniform setback alone as criteria to establish that geographic area. And then also one of the requirements,
Okay,
the county
well.
shall designate at least one area for large CAFOs. And that in that one area, all animal species previously listed may be located. So there must be a place designated. You can't just say, oh, we consider this. And, you know, one of the requirements in this piece of legislation is that there must be a place, a geographic area to be designated as appropriate for large CAFO types of land use, unless the county demonstrates one of the following is not feasible. The county's population density does not make it feasible, or the county's population density relative to the amount of private land makes it not feasible. So there's the out for those who are in more urban or highly concentrated areas or have more public to private land kinds of ratios. So those are the requirements that I wanted to review that were based on the legislation as I saw it come across my desk, and I just wanted to share this with you. And from there, I would like to ask Adam Richens if he could share some of his thoughts. This legislation largely came from some actions that happened in Millard County, and he'll give us a good idea of what happened there from the county planner's perspective, and he'll make all those nuanced comments, of course, from the county's perspective, and we'll ask him to do that, and then we'll entertain some questions about them and have a discussion. Adam, you take it away.
Thank you. My name is Adam Richens. I'm the planner and also the zoning administrator and also the building official for Millard County. For those of you that don't recall where Millard County is, we have Fillmore and Delta, and we're kind of central. We have about 13,000 people total and about just shy of 7,000 square miles. We're fairly good sized. A little bit of history about myself, only because it's relevant, is I first came across this issue back in 2006 when I was employed by Iron County. And I'm going to go controversial right off the bat and say that 98% of this legislation is about pigs. And Smithfield, or Circle 4, or Murphy Brown, there's several different entities, is a tremendously large pig producer. They are publicly owned. Most of it is owned by China. They don't like to say that because it sounds bad, and arguably it may be. But they started building down in Beaver and Iron County at least 15 years ago. Actually more than that, probably 20 plus now. The locations that they originally chose were very far from populated areas. They were mostly 20, 30, 40 miles away from any residences, any churches, anything that could have been controversial. And they got fairly well established and were very successful in that sense. They ended up being limited ultimately in growth, and mostly because of environmental issues. There's a lot of discharge from those operations. But I'll circle back to that. Just across the CAFO industry in general, the trend has become at a national and also a local level to go with economies of scale. It's very difficult to meet all the environmental requirements without scaling up and having lots of people dedicated just to meeting the permitting. So along with economies of scale, logistics, we've seen that particularly the last year, but the supply chain depends a lot on proximity. If you're close to a good shipping location, that's much better than if you're not. And that bears in a moment too, because you'll find that all up and down the I-15, particularly rural Utah, we're within about 24 hours of shipping distance from a port. So as things are produced, they can be shipped very quickly. So the location, Utah is an ideal location for these large animal producers. A little bit about Millard County. Millard County historically is agriculture. We produce a lot of alfalfa. We produce a lot of cows. We have many dairies. We're heavily agriculture. Historically, we haven't really been industrial agriculture. And that's where this kind of became a painful situation for us. Our zoning is set up. Bruce Parker, I see, is on. He'd know a little bit about this. He was involved in some of our development early on before I came. But we have conditional use permits. Some of you probably operate underneath those. But within the CAFO category, almost everything is allowed, but it has to be in the right zone and it has to have a conditional use permit. So it's not allowed everywhere. If someone wants to come in and put a very large operation, they're required to come and seek a zone change. And depending on the size of the operation, they might have some significant setbacks based on the type of animal unit. That's how it was clear up to 2016. We were mostly seeing dairies. And then a gentleman came in and applied to put a very large swine operation in just south of Deseret, which is, it's unincorporated, but it's inhabited. We've got churches and a pretty good residential area out there. And the local residents showed up en masse. It was very divisive. They were not happy to have somebody putting pigs where they would almost certainly smell them. For those of you that have a 10,000-foot setback, I would invite you to come on a tour. You can smell pigs for a lot farther than 2 miles when they're in huge numbers and there's lagoons. So what happened is the folks from Deseret were pretty vocal, and the application for zone change was ultimately withdrawn. It got a little bit too hot for the applicant. They decided they didn't want to make enemies, and they dropped it. And about that time, Murphy Brown or Smithfield, they were looking at scaling up, and they switched models. There were some very large lawsuits from their operations back east, and they switched from having company owned to I guess I would call it a contract model, where they contract for these barns with local farmers. And they say, you basically have to sell everything to us, but we'll get you set up. You're part of us, but really you're individually owned. All the risk is on you, and the environmental impact ultimately is on their land. So again, this is very one-sided. You're going to hear a very biased viewpoint. I'll own that right up front. But the smaller operators are seeing, if I can throw up a couple barns and make 100,000 a year, well, that's wonderful. But the sales are guaranteed to go to the larger company, and then the risk is held by the local operator. If anything doesn't go well, there's quite a liability. So they applied to do this down at the border between Millard County and Beaver. It's not inhabited. You're 25 miles from anybody. And the county rezoned, roughly 4 square miles, and said, sure, you guys want to do those contract barns? That's a good spot. It's not near anybody. You guys can put them there. And so they were permitted to put 230-something thousand head of pigs down at the border. Most of these go to China, almost entirely, not 100%, but almost entirely. And they are, pork is China's largest source of protein. And about, let's see, it would have been about 2018. So that's just a little bit of history. I apologize for being lengthy, but about 2018, or by 2018, they built a number of these barns and there were contractors using them. But another private company, privately owned farmer, or a farmer came in and said, I want to participate too. And they moved up into a more controversial location closer to Fillmore called the Pavant. They applied for a zone change, and they expressed that they were doing a smaller operation. It largely went under the radar, and the neighbors didn't show up en masse. And so they got started on the project. Partway through the project, after the zone change was in effect, and as you may understand, once a zone is changed, it's eligible for everything in that zone. So they secured the zone change, and then there was a change of plans, and they moved from doing a small contract farm to a very large scale breeding and gestation operation with many, many times the effluent discharge. And people came unglued. There was quite a bit of heartburn, and ultimately ultimately it was determined that they were legal to do it. They could, in fact, change the use, change the size. The zoning was in place. And so there was a lot of bad feelings over how that happened. And it was decided that perhaps a new definition that would meet more of the needs of the county would be appropriate. Beaver County had gone through similar experience, and they'd looked at placing some barns within 1,000 feet or so of the nicest subdivision and nicest homes in Beaver County. And it had really caused some grief. And Beaver had written the model of they call it a confined CAFO, but it absolutely was targeting the pigs to say, yes, there's dairies that are CAFOs, but if you're going to house everything indoors, which is one of the differences about pigs, is that they end up being mostly confined for biosecurity. If you're going to do pigs, we're going to try to categorize those different from every other type of animal. Most of us are fine with cow manure. We're rural. We don't mind the smell. It's really not that offensive for many people. But pig manure is a different thing. It's an entirely different thing. And so, following Beaver's example, Millard County went and changed some of the uses and said, we'd like to classify these differently and have more of a setback. If you're going to put that type of operation in, we think that maybe 5 miles and further, up to 10 miles away, might be more appropriate. So that passed. It was very controversial. Some of the discussion was very unpleasant. You have people saying that the pig industry is really the Walmart, or Smithfield is the Walmart of the agriculture industry. And it makes it, in fact, once they get established with a large operation, the small operations are prevented from even being nearby because of biosecurity. They basically wipe out the small farmers or the possibility to do small farming near them. But that change was made. It was challenged. It was found to be legal. And then after that happened, we had another application, and this individual came in and they applied to have a zone change for ag industrial for the specific purpose of pigs. And the location they chose, unfortunately, was in a low-lying area that floods. It's a dry lake, but it floods about every 5 to 10 years and stays flooded for weeks and weeks on end. And it's connected to a bunch of waterways. The location, unfortunately, was not really favored for building any type of business. It was a grazing zoning, and the zone change that was requested was unsuccessful. They determined that no, you can't really put stuff there. We don't want to have the liability of servicing it with any of our services. And so following that, and these were zone change requests, following that, the attorney for Smithfield, who is Steve Styler, who was up at the legislature all the time, and I'll name names, went up and influenced Sandall and some others that perhaps if the county wasn't willing to change the zone and let these large operations in, and again, it's discretionary. Zone changes are discretionary. The county was willing to and had in the right locations, but with prevailing wind conditions and such, they were pushing those operations further away than the operations wanted. Next to population centers, you have water. You have roads that are already established and maintained. You have electricity that's already been developed. The resources that accommodate a population happen to be very optimal for any other big operation coming in. And so to say that they had to be 5 miles away because of odor, they felt that wasn't fair, that they had a right to be there. Again, very divisive issue, but they went to the legislature and talked them into running a bill saying, you know what, force them to green light an area. We can't get through the zoning process at the local level, although arguably they can. We've done it, but we don't want to fight this battle. It's painful, it's difficult, and we want just to have pre-approved areas so we can come in and develop. And that's where this came from. There's other issues that are minor issues all the way around it, but 98% of this is about pigs and about one company. And it's not presented that way, but that's what it is. So I'm happy to answer questions. I'm sure that you guys probably are thinking, well, that's crazy, but there's still some heartburn in the county that they did an end run to force us to approve it.
Thank you, Adam. And, needless to say, I will say we appreciate your candor. We appreciate your perspective. As an official APA presentation, we are presenting all information forward as straightforward as we can. We don't endorse any side per se, but we are in fact wanting to figure out how to move forward with the legislation as presented. Right. And so how's that for saving our behind, Adam? Does that work?
Sure. So
yeah, thanks. I appreciate that.
Yep.
Adam, I had a question.
Please.
Do you have any insight onto this date, February 1st, 2022? Because the language there appears as though you're unable to restrict something after that date, and you have to have something adopted by that date if you want to follow the state law. And so do you have any insight on to that?
Yeah, a little bit. What was originally proposed up at the state legislature was to copy Illinois laws and to basically take, they looked at several others. I think Indiana, Illinois, they went through and they looked and they said, let's use a different system and for determining where these could be placed. And let's just say at the state level, we'll toss out local zoning and just pass a state level that includes setbacks and type. And if you're in agriculture, then you're going to be forced to play under this set of rules. It was discussed, but yeah, the intent from what I can gather is if you choose not to do something you will be stuck with the state requirements. And only if you're willing to develop something in advance that solves the problem adequately and matches that subset, do you even have a chance to be at the table. It, from what I can tell, is intended to restrict you to do something now, or you're just going to default to the state position. I'm sure that's going to get challenged, but yeah.
Okay, well, that makes sense. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question. I don't know a whole lot about pigs. I remember raising a pig with brothers and sisters, couple, and I actually learned to ride a pig, which was quite fun. But large swine operations know nothing about. And I'm just wondering if anyone could refer to acres per pig or square feet per anything that just starts to give some indication of the amount of land area to meet the minimum scale of this type of operation. So you can just start to spitball and then refine from there.
So very often they'll have barns that have 4,000, 4,400 pigs per barn, and they'll set several barns, usually two or four or six barns near each other. But because I don't know if you followed a couple of years back, not the coronavirus, but there was a African rhinovirus or something that the pigs in China were getting wiped out in mass. And so they'll have an area, probably maybe 20 or 40 acres, which is plenty big. In fact, they would have the site, there's probably only 5 or 10 acres for a lot of that, but they'd have maybe a 40-acre piece with barns, and then possibly up to a mile away before they had any other barns. So they, for a single operation, they may not need a lot of room, but if they're going to do multiple operations, they do have spacing requirements for biosecurity. So it ends up being a large area of land if they're going to do any significant numbers.
Okay, thank you. But the definitions were that the number of animals to be accommodated was, I don't know if you could go back to that slide, Adam, and
Yeah, I can do that.
just to get some basic structural pieces in the search criteria, right? You know roughly how much acreage is needed to reasonably accommodate the minimum number of animals.
Go back here just a moment. I go back to the definitions part.
Appreciate that very much.
There we go.
And
All right. Can you see that?
Oh yeah, thank you.
those, it might be worth noting that DEQ actually has these classified. So at the point where they have to obtain a groundwater discharge permit, they become a large CAFO by state definition, and possibly before that. But if they have to have a discharge permit, and these are the numbers that trigger that discharge permit. So this is not the standard operation necessarily. This is just the minimum operation that hits that category for what it's worth.
And if I could just add, Adam, thank you very much for your presentation materials. Thank you very much. It's been insightful. These are not new standards. These have been in Department of Environmental Quality standards for 15 years or so. They've been the rules, the administrative rules of DEQ. So these provisions are not new. What seems to me is new is this separation discussion and the mapping exercise that potentially Styler and others were seeing Millard County standards as being too restrictive, and then try to attack it that way by minimizing the separation or the distance from public facilities. One little warning I would toss out here is I was also involved not only with Millard County, which was my pleasure to be there, and hopefully, Adam, we set a little bit of groundwork for you that you've built on since then, but I was also involved with the Iron County discussion when Smithfield Farms first hit Iron County. My warning to you is not only do you need to define CAFOs clearly, but please go back and define agriculture clearly as well. And make sure when you define agriculture, you exclude concentrated animal feeding operations from the definition of agriculture. That is how Smithfield Farms came to Iron County. And if there's anyone here from Iron County, please correct me or add a comment. But they came in under the definition of agriculture, the growing of plants, the raising of animals, etc. So go back and check your definition of agriculture, because Iron County didn't have a definition of CAFO in place back when Smithfield first came, and they came in under the requirement for agriculture. Now, as everyone knows, agriculture is the ethic of most counties. And so we defer and make that a permitted use in every zone. So be careful and make sure you go back and be clear that when you define agriculture, you exclude concentrated animal feeding operations, and you have a standalone definition for those types of concentrated animal feeding operations separately.
Wow. So that's helpful. All of this is helpful. So a barn can handle up to 4,000 swine. I guess I'm just looking for any indications of how these animal units convert to a number of acreage amount that could reasonably be in compliance with the state law. And I'm just interested in others' thoughts on acreage.
Tim, I'll suggest something. If you ever fly from Salt Lake to St. George, you'll fly right over the top potentially of the Smithfield Farms operation in Iron and Beaver County, and it's just massive. But I think it's dependent on the operational characteristics of the operator. And so many of these barns, I recall when I was working with Iron County, I had one contractor, and I don't know if this was true or not, he was doing the concrete flooring for the barns, and said, these are massive structures. You can see the curvature of the earth when I'm laying the concrete. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but he was saying that. And then we had a number of farmers came, and agricultural farmers come and object to the Smithfield farm operation being agriculture. And they said, this is not agriculture. This is industrial development. This is industrial production of meat. This is not agriculture. And to underscore what Adam said in the separation discussion, we had one farmer come and said, I live 6 miles away from their first barn. I opened the windows in the morning and tears come to my eyes from the stench blowing into my bedroom, 6 miles away. And so, Tim, I can't give you a size, but many of these barns, I think, as Adam points, one of the locations that serves, 4 or 5 barns can be served by one effluent pond, could have up to 20,000 breeding sows.
Along that line, a pig produces a lot more waste than a person. And one of the ways that this could be mitigated, they are able to put digesters in and to basically convert that manure to a less onerous state while producing methane and even making electricity from it. That's being experimented with, and it does solve the odor issue. But short of a digester, we went on a smell trip. We took the commission during the controversial time. We took the planning commission, we took the Board of County Commissioners, we took others who were interested, and we went down to the site, and then we started driving around to see where could you smell that from. And yeah, six miles. When I was doing building inspections in Iron County on some of those buildings, I could tell with the truck with the air conditioner off, with the windows closed, at the 10-mile mark, it became very evident that I was within range. You knew it. And we wouldn't let people come back to the office after having been out there. You went home for the day and cleaned up because the odor clings to you. You go out and spend a half an hour on site, and you go back to the office, and you're gonna get thrown out. So.
Does anyone have any idea if 2 or 3 barns for 10,000 swine, how that compares to the need for 125,000 chickens?
We happen to have large numbers of chickens in Millard County, and you're not far off. If you did laying barns, you're probably proximate on the size of some of those barns to fit those numbers. They're not intended to be equivalent on building size, but you're on the same magnitude for those buildings. They also have restrictions and biohazards. For all your chicken producers, they automatically get a setback that small, unregulated operators are not allowed within a pretty significant distance from their operations. So it excludes others. The locals basically aren't able to have those activities anymore if a large one shows up.
Adam or anybody else on the call, I don't know if anybody has some sort of data or resource that we could look at for trying to help understand the impacts of the effluent on groundwater and how to incorporate that with these standards that we write in.
Let's see, there actually are some in the APA library. You'll find that there are several on regulation of concentrated animal feeding operations, on confining the impacts of confined feeding operations, planning and zoning for CAFOs, as well as hog tied by feedlots. There's a few right in the APA library that are good references. If you were to type in, boy, Google is your friend, and several universities have gone to great lengths to try to quantify and determine the impacts, and it's so complex. Pig manure really is a different in a different category. It is not similar to many other types of manure in the molecular structure, how it binds with dust and how it travels and so forth. I know you said groundwater. DWQ does have some great resources as well. The short of that is there is information available. It's not in a very digestible form. You pretty much have to go and dig it out. If you want to shoot me an email, I'll send you some of the references I've got. But basically, what you're looking at is on a discharge permit, they're simply going to monitor and try to keep the amount of effluent from exceeding certain levels. But they will be discharging, and it will affect the groundwater, and swine diseases are communicable, with people. So things to worry about or think about.
Mike, I know we're getting short of time, but a couple of comments, but no answers that I have for this one. The first one is, I'm sure we're going to non-conform some CAFOs when we adopt this ordinance. I'm sure they don't all comply. I think about, the turkey barns in Moroni and all those sort of things, and think about how you're going to affect non-conforming a CAFO potentially. So just a background, thought as you go forward. The other problem I've run into, although these are classified as agricultural buildings and exempt from the building code, if I understand correctly, Adam, some people debate that question with you, but I've had some fire departments say, well, if indeed they might be exempt from some codes, but they're not exempt from the fire code. And that's come up in a few locations as well. So coordinate with your fire guys about their position on this one. And so just think about that, because I have bumped into that issue with some fire departments saying, no, you're not exempt from the fire code. We're still going to inspect. We're still going to provide protection and suppression services. So Adam, I don't know if you've had any experience like that. Looked like you had nodded your head and said, no, yeah, that's so I'll toss that back to you. And then the last thing I will say is on the research that's available. I will underscore what Adam said. Austin, there's some good information available on various university websites. Do a search and you'll come up with a lot of information. So thank you, Mike, for allowing me to comment.
Really quickly on the buildings, the state has determined in many instances that the structure of the building may be exempt, but because of the gas and the electricity and so forth that's run in the building, that they push for the permits. Smithfield has been fairly good to work with, and the contractor's been fairly good to work with as far as getting building permits. They are very cost sensitive, but they have worked with us in that sense. We have issued permits. Iron County has done the same. They can argue the structure is exempt, but they use a tremendous amount of electricity, and electricity is never exempt from, there's too many safety issues. So they will be getting building permits. Hopefully they'll work with the building department. This isn't their first rodeo. They are willing to spend the money they have to, but only the money they have to.
Well, thank you. Appreciate Adam, your thoughts and all those who have shared. I'm going to make this presentation available to everyone here, and also some resources, specifically UCIP has come up with a draft, a sample ordinance, and I will say that sample ordinance is just a sample, and it's not necessarily the one that you should adopt, but they do have that available. And we will make this information in this presentation available to you as part of this brown bag. And I appreciate everybody spending their time, their afternoon with us, and talking about this issue. We'll keep this conversation going. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And I know that Adam has made himself available to answer questions and even tours if you'd like. And so if that is something that we'd like to entertain, if there are people that are interested in going down and visiting Millard County and going on a smell tour, then we can look into making that happen. I appreciate everyone spend their time with us, and everyone have a great day. Thank you.